Did we lose anyone to a headstone?
No, maybe a footstone though.
Well, you gotta be careful for those. All right, excellent. Welcome aboard. The Mary and Louisa set sail from New York for Shanghai, China on September 23rd, 1858. In addition to our great Captain Benjamin Jones, his lovely wife Elizabeth Swift Jones, we had 8 crew members and myself. My name is Egbert Bull Smith. No one has a portrait of me, unfortunately, so that's okay. I am the cabin boy here on the Mary Louisa. I also wrote a fantastic book by the name of The Voyage of the Two Sisters. It is my duty and responsibility to care for the needs of Mrs. Jones, the captain's wife.
I did not consider myself the adventurous sort, but felt that my role as a new wife was more important than staying home all the years that Benjamin would be away. And as the daughter of a ship captain, I was strong and self-reliant, as comfortable a seafarer as any of the crew.
We left New York South Street Seaport on the bark Mary and Louisa for a voyage to China and Japan that would take over 3 years to complete. The bark was built right here in East Setauket by Mary's uncle, shipbuilder William Bacon.
I married Captain Benjamin Jones in June of 1855, and by the time we set sail for China and Japan in September of 1858, I was only 24 years old and suffering from consumption, pulmonary tuberculosis.
Mrs. Jones, nor I, knew at the time that her friends did not expect or anticipate seeing her again in this life, and that the articles necessary for the preservation of a body were on board. Don't you think I should have known?
To maintain a strong connection with the friends and relatives I left behind, I wrote many letters home. And as the second eldest in a family of 5 girls and 3 boys, I wrote often to my sisters, asking for news of Setauket. I'm the daughter of Captain Joseph and Amelia Bacon Swift. Sadly, my father passed away while I was at sea. The news brought to me by way of one of my sister's letters.
Captain's Log, 1858. We sailed south of the East Coast and North and South America, crossed the equator on November 2nd. The bark passed below the African Cape of Good Hope on December 6th. There were many days of strong winds and high seas. We anchored off of Shanghai March 2nd, 1859, and met a number of Americans working in China to assist ships in selling their cargo and take on Chinese product.
On board, we had over 20,000 bales of cotton, hundreds of pigs, and over 19 tons of coal, with the full intent of selling goods in China and bringing back Chinese goods for New York. However, under the guidance of our great captain, we signed a contract to go and ferry goods between China and Japan, specifically to the 2 Japanese seaport cities of Nagasaki and Yokohama. These were the first 2 seaports to open up after Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan to trade with foreign nations.
I brought back many gifts from China and Japan, exotic furniture and fine porcelain, and I'm told that the chinaware and silks had a lasting effect on the local styles of the period.
For the next 2 years, Mary and Louisa carried cargo between the Chinese ports of Hong Kong and Shanghai, and the Japanese ports of Nagasaki and Yokohama. At times, Mary went with me from port to port. Other times, she stayed in the village and waited for my return.
Allow me to read a passage from my once again fantastic book, The Voyage of the Two Sisters.
Not for sale in our bookstore tonight.
It's out of print. I don't understand. One pleasant evening, several days after a storm, we had the most beautiful sunset. White, fleecy clouds, their lower edges fringed with gold and crimson. The ship was slipping quietly through the water at a rate of a mere 6 knots. The captain and Mrs. Jones were seated on the quarterdeck, talking about the voyage, the beautiful sunset, and the evening scene. In a letter to her sister Ellen, dated October of 1860, Mrs. Jones writes,
I think the country is the most beautiful I ever saw. In looking out over the hills of Nagasaki and riding out behind Kanagawa, it has a quiet, sunny beauty that has impressed me with a feeling of rest and quiet that I fancy. I shall feel nowhere else but at home. Dear me, when shall I see home again?
Mrs. Jones continues.
I hope and pray it may be the will of heaven to spare my life until I come home again, for Benjamin will not have to bear it alone. For my sake, he fears and dreads to start home. The thought is seldom from his mind, but I know my endurance is great, and the sea is better for me than the land. I have the firm belief I will be home again. My best love to yourself, ever, your affectionate sister.
Mary never returns home to Setauket. We arrive back to the South Street Seaport on September 21st, 1861. We immediately bring Mrs. Jones to her aunt and uncle's home not too far away. A few weeks later, on October 10th, Mrs. Jones passes away. She was only 27 years old.
2 days later, her body was taken to the home of my parents, Captain Walker and Charity Jones, right here in East Setauket. She is buried here in the Setauket Presbyterian Church graveyard, and her tombstone reads,
Dearest as thou were, and justly dear, we will not weep for thee. One thought shall check the starting tear, it is that thou art free. And thus shall faith's consoling power the tears of love restrain. O who that saw thy parting hour could wish thee back again.
Captain Jones makes one final trip to China on the Mary and Louisa. In a letter to his sister Susan, dated June of 1863, he writes,
I think the verses on Mary's tombstone are very appropriate. Something reminds me of her every day in Shanghai and when we were in Japan. I feel her loss more at sea than any other time, as in part. I have my mind occupied in business, but when I'm alone, I get to think of her. Thank you.